welcome to Science Minds. I'm very pleased to be joined by Christine Nordahl today, so thanks a lot for coming by.
It's my pleasure. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, we'll just jump into things straight away. I'd really like to just begin by getting kind of an understanding and hear a little bit about what brought you into the field of autism and into the field of research.
Well, it really starts with the brain. So I was interested in the brain before I got interested in autism, and I can tell you a little bit about that trajectory. So I went into college as a neurobiology major because I was really interested in, how does the brain work? I was interested in learning and memory. But then as I was taking the neurobiology major at Cornell, where I went, it's not just neurobiology, it's neurobiology and animal behavior. So I was learning about the brain, but I was also learning about all of the cool behavior that animals do, like, mating dances, songbirds, honeybees, direction. And I was like, well, this link to behavior is really, really critical. And animals were really cool, but I was also really interested in humans. And so I decided to pick up psychology as another major so that I could really try to understand the brain, not only from the basic animal behavior side of things, but then moving also into psychology and human thought and emotion and things like that. When I was in college, I did a couple of different research projects. So the research lab that I primarily worked in was actually looking at neurodevelopment. So I guess that's where my interest in how the brain forms began. And that work was working with rat models and looking at the effects of early lead exposure on learning and memory in the offspring. So this was a prenatal model of lead exposure. And we tested these rats in all sorts of different cognitive batteries. I was there with a radial maze. So this was before the internet, before computers, really. I'm dating myself here. But it was me and this big radial arm maze, and I would manually open the doors to let the rats go and explore and record how they were remembering things after they'd been treated with lead. And that was really exciting, and seeing how the brain development could be altered in these animals and what was happening to them was really of interest to me. But that project was in an animal model, and I was also very interested in human development. And so I had another research lab that I worked in where we were studying the development of reaching behavior in infants. So this time I got to work with 3-month-old babies, and we were recording how their fine motor and their motor patterns would sync with their visual sensory stimuli to coordinate the development of reaching behavior. And so those two were really the foundation of my introduction to the brain and research and science, and I sort of fell in love with it there.
And so how then did you sort of take this kind of broad background in animal behavior and early development, how did that sort of transition into autism?
So that came about in graduate school and postdoc. So I actually went to UC Davis for graduate school, and when I applied to the program, David Amaral was the chair of the neuroscience program. And I talked to him, this was back in 1998, my first introduction to the UC Davis neuroscience program. And he, at that first meeting, told me about this amazing center that was being built, the Mind Institute, and the dream of it being an interdisciplinary, collaborative place to work on neurodevelopmental disabilities, the fact that it was founded by families and rooted in this clinical sort of drive with this common mission, but it didn't exist yet. So for graduate school, I actually worked in a lab and learned how to do neuroimaging in Alzheimer's and aging research. So I worked with Bill Jagist at what's called the IDEA Lab at the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. I had also done a rotation with David Amaral and worked on some of the first human postmortem autism brain samples that we had here, looking at the hippocampus there, and that was really exciting. But again, the Mind Institute hadn't been built yet, and so I had to wait for my postdoc to come back and finally get into autism research. But I like to think that I was able to learn skills from learning how to do neuroimaging in a really established field of Alzheimer's and aging, where imaging had been used for decades, and to take that knowledge and apply it to autism and neurodevelopmental conditions where people really weren't doing imaging in really young kids at the time. And so I think that it all worked out timing-wise. I could learn some skills and then come apply it to autism research when the time was right.
What would you say are some of the ways that, like, your early work and thinking about animal behavior and translational science and Alzheimer's work maybe has impacted your approach or trajectory in autism research?
So I was saying my interest was really in learning and memory initially, and I was really interested in the hippocampus, and that's conserved across all different species. The rat is a very social sort of animal, and so there's a little bit of exposure to social development there. But then when I went into Alzheimer's and memory, it was really very much focused again on memory and learning and the hippocampus and what's happening with episodic memory. But just seeing human behavior as a whole is so much more complicated than these little tasks that we were doing. And then getting to work finally with little kids and seeing all of that develop together and how learning and memory supports social development and everything else going on, language development. I think that's when I got really interested in, how is this little person, how is this little baby developing as a whole, and what's happening in to make some kids follow the path of neurotypical development versus a developmental condition like autism. What makes them different, and how is the brain being wired differently in these kids? What are the different strengths that we can pull out and learn from kids with autism?
Yeah, for sure. Well, kind of fast forwarding to today, what in the field currently are you excited about that's kind of giving you energy and push and propelling you forward, would you say?
Well, there's a lot of things I'm excited about. So I'll start with just some of the things that I think have changed in imaging since I first got involved with it. So when I started doing neuroimaging studies in autism, there were very few studies focused on very young kids, right when they're diagnosed, which if you're looking at the brain, it's helpful to look early on, because when you're looking later, you're looking at a brain that has lived life and gone through interventions, and you're not necessarily looking at autism in the brain. And I think that's changed. So we've really there are a lot more people doing imaging of young children now, and that's in part because of some of the things that we developed on how to do MRI scanning during natural sleep in little kids. We sort of showed that was possible. A couple other things that I think are exciting is the focus on girls now. So we have a big focus on recruiting more girls with autism into our research programs, trying to understand similarities and differences between girls and boys, and the different kinds of challenges and supports that they need. The more inclusion of kids with intellectual disabilities in our research studies, I think, is another thing that excites me. Again, from our research program, we've shown that IQ score doesn't predict who can get an MRI scan. And so we've worked really closely with teams here at the Mind Institute to successfully acquire MRI scans in kids with intellectual disability that people didn't think was really possible before. So including them in research studies is, I think, really exciting now, so that we can really answer questions for people across the entire spectrum and not just a small sliver of people who are able to climb into an MRI machine easily and lie still. So that's one part I think is really exciting. I think there's just the inclusion of more people with autism in research, so that the findings that we're seeing will apply to a broader range of people. The other thing I think is really exciting is the inclusion of autistic researchers and community members in our research to help us guide our research. I think that's really critical. That's something that's certainly changed over my career. And I've been really, I'm looking forward to, so I've been doing this longitudinal study where we've been following kids starting at age 2. Some of them are coming back now at age 9 to 12, and others are coming back at 15 to 18. I can actually ask these kids, now what would be helpful to you? What kinds of things should we be researching? Thinking to their school, their future employment sort of things. And so engaging them and the families more in the direction of our research is something I'm really excited about.
One thing that you touched on that I'm really interested in is the broadening scope of including more of the heterogeneity of autism into your work. And I'm wondering what you're finding, how that's maybe changed your perspectives on autism more generally, or how it's sort of the inclusiveness maybe is driving your research maybe in different directions.
Yeah, it's, well, from the very start, the project that I've been working on for a long time, the Autism Phenome Project, the whole goal of it was to try to identify different subtypes of autism. And so if we want to try to identify subtypes of autism, we have to study everybody, right? And so that's where the inclusion really started. We wanted to take any child with autism that was interested in coming into the study and then try to understand different subgroups or subtypes better. So it really was sort of foundational in our research program. But the push that I've made to try to include kids with intellectual disability and more females into our research program is because even though we were trying to be really inclusive, we still had more males than females. We still had more kids with higher IQs and it was completing the MRI scans. And the findings that I was seeing in that group of kids, I just couldn't be confident that it applied to, say, girls with autism. Was it because I just didn't have enough girls with autism to find the difference, or was it truly not there? So that's really then we just had to go out and try to become even more inclusive in our research efforts. Yeah. I think the understanding that every child has a different trajectory, and to the extent that we can try to understand what their trajectory is and maybe the brain predictors that are going to give us a clue as to what trajectory they're on and what interventions might work best. That's really what's driving all of this is understanding each child for who they are and what set of characteristics they have that puts them on their path.
Absolutely. Thinking more about sort of the trajectory of your work, Malcolm Gladwell does a really interesting thing on one of his podcasts where he gives researchers a magic wand to basically do any kind of research that they want and ask any kind of question. And I've really been kind of inspired by that and thinking just how would researchers expand their work if they were given the opportunity. And so I'm interested if your budget doubled or tripled overnight and you kind of had carte blanche to do with what you wanted, what would you do? What would you want to explore or add to your research program?
Am I allowed to invent things that don't happen yet?
Sure, absolutely. You can do whatever you want. Yeah.
So it's not just money, it's the laws of physics and things that I can invent.
Why not?
So neuroimaging, I think, is a really powerful tool. It's the only way we can look inside the living brain, and we can look over time at the same brain and see how it's growing and changing. But there are limitations to the method. In my ideal world, it would be great to have, first of all, a way that we could scan in people where they didn't have to hold still and there weren't really loud noises. But it'd be really cool, and there are some studies now that are doing this of like simultaneous fMRI, so you can actually have people in social interactions with each other and scanning their brain and seeing in real time what's happening back and forth. I think that would open up a lot of what we could do with MRI. And that, the technology is there, but taking away the noises and the requirement to hold still, that's not there, and that would be in my dream world. But then, I think with an increased budget, obviously we would be able to hire a lot more trainees into our labs because they're the ones doing the amazing science that's going to push us into the next stage of science. I would love to be able to hire more postdocs and grad students. But I would also, and I don't know if this will be good scientifically, but I would love to give back more to our participants, right? And I know that we're constrained within ethics and and that sort of thing, but the studies that I do are really intensive for our families, and they are coming to the Mind Institute for behavioral assessments, blood draws, MRIs. It's so much time out of their day. I would love to set aside some of my research budget to do things for them that would directly help them, not as like a transactional sort of thing, but really just as the better we get to know them and what their needs are, I think the better our research is going to be. And so I would throw them parties.
That's cool. For
I would
sure.
do things like that.
That's awesome. Thinking, in looking at sort of the field more broadly and looking into the future, what do you think are the things in the field that are really going right now, and that you see as sort of propelling our field into the future?
So first is the more inclusion of autistic people and their perspectives in our research. 100%. That is moving us in the right direction. And I think also that there's a lot of team science going on and interdisciplinary science going on. I think no one method is going to help everyone and be able to do everything. But when you have a team of neuroscientists with developmental psychologists and pediatricians and preclinical researchers informing your work, it's just going to make the science better. And more and more, I think there's funding going towards these large team science projects. I think that will make things move faster and better.
Well, I really appreciate getting to talk with you, and your perspective is excellent. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. I had fun.
Yeah, this is great.
A lot of fun.
Thanks a lot.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was founded in 1998 with the promise to reduce and prevent the disabilities that can be associated with autism and other neurodevelopmental conditions. Every day, our clinicians and researchers make progress on that promise. Our groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other conditions associated with disability are helping affected individuals achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website or our social media platforms to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.